Uh, all right, so today we'll be talking about psychological safety, what makes this important for us as people, and why is it important probably to have psychological safety when we have relationships. So relationships, I guess, Karen, and you can always correct me, relationships can be personal relationships or work relationships. So psychological safety is very, very important in any type of relationships, even team relationships. And we have also Karen Kemerling with us. So Karen, thank you so much for accepting this engagement. So we're so happy to have you. It's a privilege, it's an honor for us. So Karen is a very inspirational person for me personally, Oscar as well. I believe it's the same thing for you and for many people in the agile industry. So you're also a leader, Karen, in leadership, different leadership initiatives, and you are also founder of K2 for leadership development. So I will let you introduce yourself in more details. So thank you so much again for joining us, and I will let you take it from here. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, Caitlin, or Kaylin, is that how I say it? And Oscar for organizing this. We've been at it for a couple of months here, trying to plan for this. So appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you all, and I know it might be after your workday, so so hopefully this is a good use of an hour or so for you. And as we go through talking a little bit about what is psychological safety and why does it matter. Um, you can also take some notes. One of the things that I have been in the corporate world for 35 years, and over the last probably 4 or 5 years, I've been retired from the corporate world. I was an engineer originally, and then got my doctorate degree in organizational development, and I left corporate as the president of a company in downtown Denver, a financial technology company. And I tell you that background partly because one of the most important things as I reflected back on my career was this work that we're talking about today. If I maybe would have been better, if I would have been better at making and developing and creating a culture of inclusiveness and psychological safety, even some of those teams and companies would have been more successful. So I truly believe it's the secret sauce. It's the most important thing in teams and in companies, and I think in any kind of social group, being able to create and develop an environment where it's safe is super important. So take some notes, write some things down. I might ask you to talk or put some things in mute in chat as we go through it, so it's not just me talking, because that's not all that exciting. I'd like you to engage and think through this from your perspective and how it affects you. So I'm gonna share my screen. Um, and you all got to help me out a little bit. Um, can you see my screen? Give me a thumbs up. You can see the, okay,
Yes, we can.
awesome. Thank you. Let me move this over. Okay, so to start with, the PhD in me will make me say I have to give sort of credit to the other researchers and folks that have really helped one build this, not only this presentation, but I teach this from a workshop standpoint. And so a lot of these thought leaders are a core part of bringing content into that workshop. And let me start with Timothy Clark, who is a PhD and an Oxford researcher. He runs a company called Leader Factor, and he has a book called The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. And we're going to use his framework to unpack these 4 stages and talk about how do we move from inclusion to challenger safety. So thanks to him. The next person on here is Brene Brown, and many of you may know her. She's based out of Texas, and she's a clinical social worker, and she's pretty popular. She's actually got her own, I think, Netflix show, but she's out there all over as far as TED Talks and speakers, and I've had the good fortune to go through her work So I get to bring some of her stuff in here, and she's a big researcher on vulnerability and shame and how that impacts the way we show up as leaders. The next person is Amy Edmondson, yet another PhD from Harvard. And she's in the 90s. She's kind of one of the founding people that started psychological safety and that coined that term. So a lot of credit to her. She has a book called The Fearless Organization, and she also has something called FOSS, which is the Fearless Organization Scan, and it's assessment that you can take to assess the actual sort of psychological safety within a team, and it's really simple. And if at the end of this, you can go to my website and actually find that link and take that survey for free. But there's only 7 questions, and it's pretty easy to dig into what's going on for you personally as well as your team. And the last person on here is David Rock, and he's actually a medical doctor. He's a neuroscientist, so he studies the brain, and he runs something called the Neuro Leadership Institute. And so, one of the things I've also gone through his work, and I am a brain-based coach. So when I coach people, or even part of the workshops, we talk a lot about how does the brain respond to threat. And so that's pretty important as we dig into what makes an environment safe and how is our brain sort of processing information. So thanks to David Rock. He's got a number of good books, and you can look him up and find out more about him. So thank you for those folks that built the framework for this and helped me. Um, and then, so what are we going to do in the next probably half hour, 45 minutes? I want to talk about the definition of what is psychological safety. So we kind of walk away with that. So if you're taking notes, be sure we write that down. The second thing is, why does it matter? So once we understand a little bit about what is it, now it's like, well, so why do I care? You know, why is it important to me? And then the last thing we'll dig into, and we don't have enough time to go deep because the workshop again is very deep, rich kind of unpacking of how do you do this. But today we still hopefully will get like, you know, a couple of nuggets as we go through this framework of Tim Clark's to talk about how do we do this now that we know what it is and now we know why it's important, like how do I do it? So hopefully that's what you'll get out of this. Um, and then we'll end with really a Q&A. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end and you guys can ask some questions and we can talk about kind of what's coming up for you. All right, so first thing, and this is where I'm going to ask you to jump into chat, and maybe I'll ask Kalina to read the chat, or Oscar, but when you see what is psychological safety, I'm curious, like, what do you think that is? Like, what have you heard or what do you know about it? So put that in chat, your definition of what is psychological safety to you?
Some people say feeling of security, trust,
Mm-hmm.
being mentally stable.
Okay.
Feeling safe to speak without getting ridiculed or reprimanded.
Good.
Yeah. Allowed to speak up with repercussion. You have a good response here.
No repercussions, actually. Heidi, she corrected
Okay.
for herself. Yeah.
Take a risk without worrying about repercussion. Feeling you can be yourself in any environment, work or personal.
Awesome.
Feeling safe to take smart risks. Daring to take initiatives.
So those are awesome. So thank you for contributing. There's a theme, right, kind of coming up where I'm hearing and I'm seeing sort of like this concept of it's okay to sort of be who I am and show up and um, challenge things or see things differently. Tim Clark, so we'll use him as an example, would say it's just 5 words and that's easy for me to remember, but it's an environment of rewarded vulnerability. So if you think about some of the things that you were just putting in chat around psychological safety, if you think about what's the core emotion in some of those things, and it really is around vulnerability. right? And so now my question would be is, what is vulnerability? Put that in chat. So when you think of the word vulnerability, what comes up for you? And while you're doing that, I'll tell you a quick story. So I live in Colorado, so Denver, Colorado, that kind of area, and we have a lot of um, meadows. And it right now is the time when um, deers are having baby deers, and so there's like little deers all over, and it's really cool. It's beautiful. But in the meadow, sometimes I have this feeling when I think of vulnerability is of like a deer in the meadow by itself, and I can see around the perimeter of the meadow like a mountain lion.
Oh, we have some responses here: exposure of weakness, being able to express fully myself,
Hmm.
drop the guard, yeah,
Yeah.
sharing openly, authentically on oneself, exposing my shortcoming.
Yep. Okay, so those are great. So it relates again. My story is a little bit like, just I want to hear what you guys are thinking too. It's like, so from this meadow story with this deer, like the idea is you feel vulnerable for the deer, right? You feel it in your gut. Like you have three brains, right? We say it's the one between our ears. Our heart has a brain, which is mostly our values, and our gut has a brain, which is really our intuition. So some of the things that are coming up in chat, like it relates to your gut probably more than anything. You feel it in your intuition, sort of. Like when I think of the deer, just to kind of get into that emotion, I think of fight, flight, and freeze. Those things come up for me with that deer. And think about that in a work environment, right? If you're in a meeting and you bring something up and it gets shot down immediately, you can do three things, right? It's like one, you can push back and get defensive because you're triggered by it, which I certainly have done a few times. And other times you just shut down. It's like, fine, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to shrink back. Um, or the third thing is can't wait to get out, sort of flight, like get out of the room and have the meeting after the meeting with your buddy about the meeting, which is even worse, right? But it's the same kind of thing. It's that feeling in your gut and that responsiveness. So, um, what else do you see, Oscar? Anything else in the chat that's coming up on the vulnerability?
Yeah, I can go, Karen. Being able to express fully myself, sharing openly and authentically oneself, exposing my shortcoming. This is from Christoph. Emmanuel, freedom of expression. So drop the guard from Madhukar.
Nice.
Yeah,
Good. Thank you.
welcome.
So if we go into what Brene Brown would say, so normally I play this video and she talks to us about vulnerability and shame, but since she studies this, I want to bring in her definition of vulnerability. And she would say it's the core emotion, it's the key to love, belonging, joy, and empathy. So when I think about those emotions, I think, what person on the planet doesn't want to feel those? Everybody wants to feel loved, belonged, included, and have that ability to be empathized and empathize with someone else. She also would say it's the birthplace, it's the core to innovation and creativity. So if we think about Tim's definition of what is psychological safety, an environment of rewarded vulnerability, and if we marry that with Brené's definition of vulnerability and we say it's two things, right? It's love, belonging, joy, and empathy, and it's that core thing when you show up and you feel safe, that you can feel like innovation and creativity is what you bring to the workplace or to the group, because you belong and because you feel included and because you're being rewarded for being who you are and for being vulnerable. So that's our definition, an environment of rewarded vulnerability. Let's talk a little bit more about why does it matter. So first things is when we think about vulnerability, every one of us does this. whether we're thinking about it or not, in every situation, we show up and we try to figure out, is this safe or not safe? And whether you're thinking about it or not. For example, this room, this whole presentation that we're doing together. If if you came in today and we immediately sort of started barking out orders and yelling like, hey, you weren't on time, and go, a bunch of rules and things like that, immediately people would start to feel like, whoa, like this is, maybe I'm not going to stay. Maybe I'm not going to like be here for an hour or so because it's not, I don't feel safe. It doesn't feel warm. You can tell when you go into a restaurant too, right? If the wait staff welcomes you, you walk in and they're like, we're happy to see you. You feel warm. You feel like they're getting along. You can feel the chemistry. It feels like you're, what I would say, safe, and sort of you're open. You're sort of invited. On the opposite side, you can tell when you walk into a restaurant, when people are like stressed, the wait staff is after each other, they kind of don't care about you. You're just one more number. It's like, oh, just take a seat. We'll get to you when we can. You're in that sort of, like this doesn't feel good. And so when you go into that red zone or the defensive state, you're in an environment where vulnerability is not being rewarded. And when that happens, we go into personal risk management. And this comes from David Rock and our neuroscientist, where your head, your brain is now triggered to go offline and focus on, how do I take care of myself? Loss preservation and avoiding sort of some sort of incident or some problem that could come up. So when you're in that zone, when you're in that red zone, I would say this is part of the reason I told you a little story about the tiger, and this is a tiger versus a mountain lion, but nobody comes up with a good idea at work, at home, with your friends, whatever, when you're triggered, when you're in that red zone, when you feel like you're being chased by a tiger. Now, we're not being chased by tigers for the most part anymore, so we all know that story, but our brain doesn't know a lot of difference. We're still in that fight, flight, and freeze zone. We're still triggered, and therefore we're back into, how do I take care of myself? How do I armor up? And how do I avoid loss? So I want to do just a quick little experiment with you, and I'm going to come out of presentation mode here for just a second. And I'm going to put this link in chat. And if you want to go to your browser, take this little experiment with me. And there's 5 things here that I'm asking you. Have you ever felt excluded in a social setting? Have you ever been afraid to ask a question? Have you ever remained silent? Have you ever knew the answer to a problem that somebody else answered for you? Somebody steal credit for what you did? And have you ever felt ignored in a discussion? So go in and take that, and you can vote for all of them if you want. And you can see my screen still, right? Can you guys see my browser screen or no?
Yes, we can, Karen.
So
Yeah.
you can see the little
Yeah.
bars going up and down. Am I right? Yes?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
very nice.
Okay, cool.
Very dynamic.
Cool. So there's how many of us here? 28? Yeah. Let's take one more minute. Has everybody kind of voted? Yeah, okay. So what's cool about what we just did is that every single one of those somebody has felt, if not all of them, which means we've all felt excluded. We've all been in a situation where we felt it wasn't safe. It wasn't psychologically safe to show up and be who we were. We were all triggered in some way, shape, or form by this. So when that happens, I'm on the next slide. You can see the slides, right? Yes? Cool, thank you. So this comes from research from a woman named Christine Porath, and she has a book called The Price of Incivility, but she spent a lot of time focusing on the cost associated to feeling not safe in a work environment. And so we just said every one of us can relate to one of those five, if not all five of those. And so I've just highlighted the things that are above 50% here. So if you're triggered, you're in that red zone and you don't feel safe, 80% of the time we've lost work worrying about that situation. I know I have had that feeling. 63% lost time avoiding the person. So now I don't want to see that person. I don't want to work with them. I'm trying to get away from the situation. 66% said that their performance declined, and 78 said that their commitment to the organization declined. So that's key. This is huge. Back to why does this matter? Because we just said this is an environment of rewarded vulnerability. And when we don't feel safe, and we've all said we don't feel safe, this is a huge impact to businesses and to teams. So I would say the two big things, the two big reasons this is such a big thing happening, and I know Canada itself has this, it has their own sort of wellness, I would almost call it like an ISO standard about psychological safety. But the idea here is this is the new leadership competency. So I'm going to pause for a second. Kalina, do you have a question?
Yes, Karen, I definitely have a question about what you just mentioned, how important it is to feel safe.
Yeah.
Because me as a coach, when I do professional coaching, it's so important to establish this psychological safety with the other person in the relationship. And if you don't have it, definitely you cannot develop the potential on the other side. It's so limited, so it will be very superficial conversation. So it's very, very important, the safety for us.
That's a thank you for adding that point. Coaches, um, product owners, scrum masters,
Oh, yes.
anybody in the agility space, actually anybody, right? Managers, leaders, teams, anybody. Um, you know, I just want to plus one what you're saying because I would agree, right? It's the
Absolutely.
core. The first ingredient in anything is the person and the team. Outside of the software, the process, the product, the what have you, it's the person that's going to be doing this. And if they feel connected and they feel safe and they feel like they're included and part of something, that's the first step. Super important.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
There is another hand, by the way.
Okay, go
Oh,
for it.
it's my friend Oscar.
Yeah, Karen, sometimes they lead us by showing vulnerability. For example, asking a question, admitting a mistake, saying I don't know. For them, it's a weakness. For some leaders. Which your coaching tips you can and your advice about that?
So hold that thought because we're going to get into that a little bit, if that's okay. Let's talk about vulnerability and leaders modeling the way, because I think you bring up a really good point.
No problem.
Cool.
Karen, there's also something in the chat. Christoph is asking, can you please repeat the source to the cost of breach on slide 9?
Yeah. It's where is that? So I can provide this stuff too, but her name is Christine Porath, Porath, and she has a book called The Cost of Bad Behavior, and the statistics come from her. So in the spirit of time, I'm going to keep us moving just because we got a couple other things I want to get through and see if we can actually dig into how do we do this, because I think you'll enjoy that. But I'm still building the case of why does it matter, right? So the first thing we said is what is it? And it's an environment of rewarded vulnerability. And so vulnerability is the core emotion to love, belonging, joy, and empathy. It's also the birthplace for innovation and creativity. So why is this important to business? We all feel it. So there's two big things really starting to bubble up. One is sort of diversity, equality, equity, and inclusiveness. So that's happening in a lot of businesses right now. And on the other side, this innovation and creativity, people are bringing their best selves to work. And that's where people start to become really competitive. It's the thing for businesses where the secret sauce starts to come out because people start to challenge the status quo. And that's what we need in order to build creativity and innovation. So I would say this is the leadership competency of the 21st century. And let's just say even since COVID, like this is really the thing that's happening in businesses. And so this is super important to build the case for why does psychological safety matter. So I want to get into how do we do it. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about this model. And this is Tim Clark's model. And we're going to get into inclusion, learner, contributor, and challenger. But I want to talk about the X and the Y axes first. So on the X axis, it says permission. And if you go all the way to the right and you have very low respect, but a lot of permission, you end up in this black space called exploitation. So what is that? So here's an example. Let's pretend that Oscar's my boss, and he honestly doesn't care a lot about me as a person. He doesn't know where I live. He doesn't know if I'm married. He doesn't know if I have kids or whatever, my hobbies. He doesn't care. But what he does care about is giving me a lot of autonomy and a lot of things to do, regardless of whether I work late nights, weekends, holidays, whatever. It doesn't matter because I'm just here to crank things out. So that's when, and I'm kidding, right? So you're not this way, Oscar, but I'm just using you as an example. He's exploiting me, right? It's like that's an example of far on the x-axis and low on the y-axis. So if we go the other direction, if we go up the y-axis and we go low on the permission, and we'll use Oscar again, now the scenario is he knows everything about me and we're buddies. He knows, who my spouse is and our dog and our grandchildren and blah, 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 all of this. And we get along great. We really enjoy each other, but he doesn't give me a lot of autonomy. He doesn't give me a lot of opportunity to grow and learn. He's sort of like a helicopter parent, if you will. He's more micromanaging, and that's where the paternalism comes in. So the goal in the model here is to stay away from the extremes of the X and the Y axis and go up the middle, right? So there's a balance of permission and respect and autonomy as we move up to the top stage, which is really challenger safety. Okay, so now it's important to definitely write some stuff down. So here's where I'm going to ask for some help, and maybe I'm going to call on, let's see, Jim, are you willing to come off mute and read this definition of inclusion safety for me?
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay. Inclusion safety is the basic human need to be included, accepted, and belong. You're accepted for who you are, including your unique attributes and defining characteristics.
Awesome. So thank you. And we just went through that little survey where every one of us said we've all felt excluded. So we can all relate. So what is this about? So being excluded socially is very hard. It's almost worse than physical pain. So physical pain, if we broke your leg or what have you, you could get a cast, you could go through therapy, you can take pain pills and so forth. If you feel rejected socially, many times you can't even see it. And I like to use the analogy of it's like a bullet sort of ricocheting around inside your brain, it hurts, but it's not obvious. So it's hard. And when we're at the inclusion level, the idea here is that if you're a human on this planet and you're not hurting somebody else, you should be included. We're not talking about giving people responsibility to do things within work related to skills. We're talking about, hey, we're gonna have virtual coffee today, or we're gonna have a beer today, or whatever it is, right? And we don't exclude people. we include everybody. And when we go and we say hello to people in the mornings or through chat, we don't exclude people. Everybody matters. Everybody is included. So the question would be is, why do we exclude people? Why does that happen? And I want to focus in on, we have bias and stereotypes. So this myth of superiority is key, because we're all born and we all grow up in a particular environment. You're a man, you're a woman, it's a certain culture, there's a gender, there's ethnics, there's I'm tall, you're thin, you're heavier, what have you. In the United States, you're Democrat, you're Republican, different religions, different education. Some people would say, oh, you're a PhD or you're a medical doctor or you don't have a degree. There's a lot of judgment and a lot of bias going on associated to different types of things that we've learned over the years. And that happens at work. So let me give you an example of one of my challenges is that I don't like guns. And so I can say that I would have to watch that. If I had someone that worked for me that was very pro-gun, that it was a right and I can have a gun, I should be able to carry a gun, it's hard for me not to judge them immediately. And I might not want to include them in, hey, we're going to have coffee. Would you like to come? Because I'm triggered by my mental model of what I think. And that may or may not be right. So that's just one example. So let's talk about, well, so how do we create inclusion safety? If I have these bias, what do I do? David Rock would say, if you have a brain, you have a bias. It doesn't make you bad. It just makes you human. We're just human. So one of the first things we can do is really examine, like, what are my bias and my stereotypes? Where do I feel triggered? Maybe in my gut or my heart or even in my head. And so in my scenario with the gun thing, rather than making up this story of, oh, this person is immediately sort of bad and is going to hurt people, it's an opportunity for me to get curious. It's an opportunity for me to seek to learn versus react based on my bias. Maybe there is something I can learn. It doesn't mean I have to agree, but what it does mean is it gives me an opportunity to really seek to learn versus make up a story in my own head about what I think that is based on the bias that I've learned over the years. So we don't have time to dig into all of this, but that's one of the first things you can do as you're taking notes and you're thinking about, what are my bias and how can I be inclusive of folks? Like, write that one down and think that one through. So let's move to the next stage. I'm going to ask, I think it's, let's see if I can say the name right. Is it Yuju? Y-U-J-U? Would you be willing to read learner safety for me?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
Learner safety satisfies the basic human need to learn and grow. You feel safe in the learning process, asking questions, giving and receiving feedback, experimenting, and even making mistakes.
Awesome. Thank you. So this is natural, right? Once you feel included, let's assume that we've moved past, and it's not a one-time thing. Like, inclusion is like diet and exercise. Like, you have to do it every day. People have to feel loved and belonged and included and valued every day. But once you do, it's pretty natural to say, hey, I want to learn stuff. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We have basic food and clothing and shelter sort of at the bottom, and then we start to move into, I want to learn and I want to grow. And that's what's happening here. But in order to do this, we have to get into feeling safe and feeling encouraged. And what I have in here is an example of, have you ever had somebody had more courage and more sort of confidence in you than you did in yourself? And I'll give you a quick example. So I'm trying to learn how to play guitar. And I suck pretty much, but I have a good teacher. And the thing about him that's great is that he doesn't, I never feel silly or awkward or dumb with him. I put the pressure on myself, but he really has this ability to disconnect this concept of failure from mistakes. And mistakes are part of growth and learning. And a lot of you are agilists, right? So it's like this growth mindset and this concept of, you know, let's try, let's inspect, let's adapt, let's iterate, let's do it again. And it's that same concept when we're trying to get into learning and growing. Um, and one of the things that's hard when we're learning as adults is we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, right? It's like we think we need to know it all rather than ask for help. And this is hard because if you feel that you're in that red zone, back to our little flow chart, you're in that defensive sort of emotional state, where you're in that fight, flight, or freeze, the oldest part of your brain, the amygdala, has actually gone like triggered, and the front part, the executive process, has gone offline. Your ability to learn is totally impaired. You are now back into that loss preservation mode where it's like that's all I care about. And I whatever anybody's saying after that point, I'm not getting it because I can't focus. Um, so learning needs safety and it needs support in order for that top part of your brain to be able to say, I'm creating some new pathways and I'm learning. So how do we do this? First thing is separate, back to my guitar example, this concept of this fear of failure from mistakes. Simon Sinek, if you've heard of him, he would say use the word falling instead of failure. Replace that word, because the falling thing is if we fall, we get back up. But that doesn't mean we're a failure. It just means we got to get back up and keep going. So the other thing is we're going to feel awkward. And when we feel awkward, that's when your brain is starting to develop new pathways in your brain, which is great. And that's when you're learning. So this is something I think, Oscar, you brought up, is this modeling vulnerability, and how managers many times feel like, I don't want to say that I don't know. And this is where it takes some courage, this vulnerability side of psychological safety, this ability to say, I don't know. So let me give you another example here. Let me go back to, let's say I work for Caitlin and we're in a meeting, and I want to learn something new. And I ask her, would it be okay if I do that? And will you help me? And if she says, you know what, Karen, I don't know how to do that either, but I know that Oscar does. So I compare the two of you up. Or she may say, guess what? I don't know how to do it, but we could learn it together. Can you imagine how safe and how supported I would feel if she talked to us that way? Where it's like, wow, my boss makes it very public that it's like, I don't know, but I can pair you with someone who does, or we'll learn together. And that concept of being vulnerable and showing up is super important. So that's another example. Oscar, did that get at the point you were asking about earlier?
Yeah, exactly. My question was, if you say to your team, I don't know, and you admit your mistakes, sometimes can be seen like you are so weak. So the coaching, which your coaching tips for that, for leaders?
Say that last part again. Sorry, it's hard for me.
Yeah, which are, for example, for the leaders who have the fear to be seen like, if I show my weakness, if I show my vulnerability, it's not good for me, for the teams. Which your coaching tip to bring them to foster psychological safety, for example?
Yeah, so I think the hard part is being able to look at vulnerability as a strength and
Okay.
being able to be safe to say, I don't know. And that is a superpower on behalf of that leader to model the way, in our example, to be able to say that, which creates learner safety, right? Um, and putting all that pressure on ourselves to know it all, no, people know right away when a boss does that and they don't know. You can feel it, you can see it. I don't know about you guys, but I have a lot more respect for that leader that is authentic and says, guess what? I don't know either. And that doesn't make me weak. That actually makes me stronger and smarter to be able to ask for help from others. So the other thing on this that kind of goes into the coaching spectrum is really, as people are learning and growing, at the beginning of the learning process, they need support and maybe more direction. So this concept of ask and tell. So at the beginning, people are being told sort of like, here's how you do it, and modeling the way. But as they start to grow and learn, we transfer what I'd call ownership and critical thinking to the learner by stepping back from telling and starting to ask sort of more probing, open-ended questions about, how do you think we might do that? Or why do you think this would work or won't work? Or how might we approach that? So the idea here is really to get the learner to get this critical thinking, to start to own the responsibility for the learning component with support from the leader and from the team, so that they don't feel abandoned, they don't feel awkward if they don't know. So there's some opportunities to help build learner safety. All right, I'm going to keep us going. So I'm going to the next step, which is contributor safety in our model. And how about, let's see, is it Tara? Would you be willing to read this for, I'm just kind of going on my Hollywood Squares list here, so I'm just picking people if that's okay. Would you come off mute and read this for us if you feel comfortable doing that?
Yeah, I couldn't find the mute button. Sorry.
Awesome.
Contributor safety satisfies the basic human need to make a difference. You feel safe to use your skills and abilities to offer a meaningful contribution.
Awesome. Thank you. So here we go. We're building, right? We feel included. We feel valued as a human. We've started to learn. And now we're at that stage where now we have the skill and the will to actually plus one things, to really look at things from a, how do I modify? How do I change this? How do I contribute? So this is something that you earn, as opposed to our first step, which was inclusion safety. You don't have to earn being included. Because you're a human on the planet and you're not hurting somebody else, you're valuable and you should be included. Contributor safety is a little different in that now that you've learned, now you have a skill, right? Now you want to contribute at yet a higher level. So you have this concept of, I have the skill and I have the will, sort of these two things that are building. So you earn it, right? You get this opportunity to get in the game because now you've done the practice, you've showed up, you know the plays, and you get to get into the game and start to contribute. It doesn't mean that you can't go back to learning. So there's this kind of circular process, but you've earned it. So I wanted to bring that up because it's a little different than inclusion safety. So when we talked about the model with paternalism and exploitation, one of the things that happens a lot as companies go through agile transformations, and a lot of you are agilists and coaches and so forth, and I know I've felt this, is that some of the manager roles start to change, right? So we have product owners and we have scrum masters, and the actual titles of roles and things are changing. And so a lot of times managers that used to be kind of in charge of everything get triggered. And it's like, what's my role? Where do I fit in? And they start to pull back. They start to like, you should check in with me, and I don't really understand this Scrum thing, and what are you guys working on, and what is a stand-up, and why is that important, and what's a backlog? And so you can feel this paternalism starts to come up, and that can be one of the impediments for people getting into this contributor safety and really feeling like they can add value. So I bring that up because I think it's one of the things that can get in the way. So how do we do it? So I want to start with the big picture of explaining the why. So as people get into the contribution at this level, it's like, what's important? You know, why are we doing this thing? So big picture. Then the next thing is, assign the thing that they're going to do based on their competency. And then the last part of this is really delegate the how, which transfers, again, ownership and empowers the individual. But we don't abandon them, right? So people don't want to get lost in the, well, you've delegated this to me and I know what to do. Sometimes people can get stuck. So this vulnerability thing is important, where people can go back to the learning piece and say, hey, I need help. I'm stuck on this process, and I know that I've learned, but I still need to go back to learning again, and then I can go back to contributing. Um, so those are 3 things we can do to start to build contributor safety. So now we're at the final stage, which is challenger safety. And Kaylin, I'm going to ask you to read this one. Would that be okay?
Yes, of course, Karen. So challenger safety satisfies the basic human need to make things better. You feel safe to speak up and challenge the status quo when you think there is a need or opportunity to improve.
Awesome. All right, so this is it. We're at the top now. We've gone through, you're included, you're learning, you're contributing, you're kind of going back between contributing and learning. But as you learn and you contribute and you feel safe, and this is an environment of rewarded vulnerability, challenging the status quo is the most vulnerable. But this is where innovation and creativity happens. So we would say challenging is really about, I don't know if some of you have heard of Kim Scott, but she has this concept of radical candor, right? And that's what we're talking about here. Divergent thinking, constructive dissent, creative tension. Like that's the challenger safety component. But because it's the most vulnerable, you have to come up with what is what I would call air cover in exchange for being willing to speak up. Because if you speak up and there isn't air cover, there isn't support, you will go right back, or we will all go right back to that red zone, back to that flow chart of safe and not safe. So the idea here is we've got to provide support and love and care for that person if they're going to speak up. So how do we do that? So this little picture on the right that says social friction with the arrow up and, intellectual friction with the arrow up and social friction with the arrow down is key. Because as we start to challenge whatever the process, let's say there's something that's been in place for 20 years and your boss did it, and he or she is very proud of it, and you want to challenge that. That takes a lot to be able to speak up and say, hey, I think there's a better way. So I want to talk about focusing on the intellectual friction component of it. So the process is what we want to change. We want to stay focused on that thing and give our energy and expertise to focusing on the issue, not the problem. And that takes a lot because people are sensitive and emotional creatures, and we're driven by our emotions. And because of that, this takes a fair amount of humility and recognizing our own egos, and the ability to really accommodate people that are going to disagree. So how do we do that? So formally assigning dissent, sort of going into what is air cover, right? And what I mean by that is rather than having one person feel like they want to speak up, if you make it part of the process, and I have a couple things in here as examples, you know, if within the room you have a token where you say, hey, today Karen's going to be the loyal opposition to whatever we're talking about, and that's part of the process, then it's more accepted. This concept of V2MOM, it's an acronym for Visions, Values, Methods, Obstacles, and Measures. That comes from Salesforce.com. But the idea is, again, like as you're working on things together, obstacles is part of the process. And that's part of talking about, hey, I want to challenge whatever it is that we're dealing with or we're talking about. So not one person is feeling like they always have to be the one, or they bring things up and then they're triggered because they're uncomfortable. So it's that threat detection and trying to make it as safe as possible, back to our flow chart. So I want to summarize then, and then I'll see if we still have a few minutes for questions. If y'all have to go, I can understand. We got started a couple minutes late, but so what is it? What is psychological safety? And we said it's this environment of rewarded vulnerability, right? And why does it matter? We had two big things that came up for us. DE and I, and this concept of love, belonging, joy, and empathy from our friend Brene Brown, and helping with competition and market forces, right? Because we bring our best selves, and this is where innovation and creativity starts to happen. And then how do we create it? We include people, watch our stereotypes and bias, encourage learning by providing support, admitting when we make some mistakes, transferring that ownership into asking some really insightful questioning, and contributing. So once you have the skill and the will, you earn this and you get support along the way. And then finally, you challenge the status quo by increasing intellectual friction, what we just talked about, decreasing social friction, and assigning kind of this dissent or this ability to disagree as a part of the process. So I'm going to stop there and open it up. Let's turn it back over to Kalina and Oscar for questions or thoughts from the group.
I think you respond to all the questions. We want to just thank you so much, Karen. That's a great topic for us, so for everybody. You're an amazing facilitator. We love your subject. Your topic is really amazing, and it's in all the company. This is the challenge we have in our company. To be a good leader, it's not just to bring your competencies. You have to show empathy. You have to admit your mistake, and you have to create a psychological safety for your teams to show your vulnerability. So it's a great topic. Thank you so much for that.
Yes, Oscar. So we have one hand from Abdullah. So I would like to suggest you to take it. Maybe we can just take a few minutes and close this after that. Are you okay with that?
Of course.
Sure. Abdullah, please.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, just one quick question. I work in Saudi Arabia, and it's kind of new now. The females are in the workforce and they're working. So I have almost 5 to 6 female employees, and like we're a diversified team. But I still did not know. I don't know how to test their psychological safety. We have our stand-up meetings. We have our touch points. But I don't know if there's a way that could have me more understand how do they feel psychologically within the team, because they don't talk a lot. We have our meetings, they just listen. So it's kind of new to them. So if there's any approach, any way I can which can help me understand them more.
That's great. Thanks for even asking and wanting to be thoughtful and inclusive of them. I'm sure others on this call probably have some opinion. I'll try my best, but I would say what you just said, your authenticity and your caringness, I could feel it. And it's like maybe just even starting there by telling people, hey, this is what I'm intending to do, and I'd like to be inclusive. What would feel good to them? And sometimes it helps to start small. So if you start in a one-on-one situation versus a group, it's less triggering. It's more safe. So that might be one approach that you could try. Just what you just said, I think was tremendous, and I think starting there and asking what they would need to feel safe to speak up is a great idea. Cool.
Okay, all right. So we have another question from Christoph.
Yeah. So this relates to stage 1. You mentioned that we need to watch our own biases. And I would argue maybe you agree this takes a lot of cognitive effort. And would you agree that one has to have a lot of self-confidence in order to First, watch the own biases, be aware of that, and step over these.
Yeah.
Or maybe this is not necessary. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So Christoph, thank you for the question too. David Rock would say it's really hard to see our own bias. But one thing you can do, again, others may have thoughts, so I'm happy to let somebody else have the floor too here. But one thing you can do is there's assessments that you can take. But even just the little list, and I'll give you guys the slide deck that I put in here, is just to do some of your own introspective and say, you know, where do I have some bias? And then get an accountability buddy. Get somebody that you trust that might want to do this with you, that actually will be willing to give you feedback, like how you might show up in a meeting, how you may or may not include folks, and make it safe to provide feedback to you so that you can see how you're showing up through others' eyes, as opposed to trying to hold the mirror up and look at yourself, which can be really, really hard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm more about the question whether it takes a lot of self-confidence in order to say be able or be willing to step over prejudice. What's the English term for that? Prejudices or biases.
Yeah.
Maybe this is also a question for the entire audience,
Sure.
what the others say, because what I'm trying to point to is maybe there is some vicious circle. I try to establish some psychological safety so that others feel confident or more confident in themselves. But in order to do that, I first need to have self-confidence so that I can step over my own biases and provide the safety for others.
Yeah. So what do others think? I like that. Anybody else have some thoughts about Christoph's question? Self-confidence is kind of the core of it. Am I getting that right, Christoph?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool.
I think one needs a lot of self-awareness to figure out your list of bias. Because if like we're always not really mindful of how we are, and mindfulness comes back to a lot of self-awareness, because if we're always thinking about something else and not about how we are as a person, it's really hard to come with that list. So I wouldn't think it's a confidence thing. It's more of a awareness, like how much time do we spend, or do I even spend, reflecting on just how I am. So spending that time doing your own reflection versus having the confidence to do it. That would be kind of my thinking.
I share the same opinion. And also sometimes I know that there are some tests that you can eventually do. I did personally one of those tests about biases, limiting beliefs, and then it showed me a lot of surprises. So I was thinking I'm perfect. And then you see all of those biases coming in the game. Some of them you even do not know that they exist. So it's not easy. Even self-awareness is not easy to discover most of them, but it helps when you're self-aware. It helps you decide how you want to act. So that's helpful. You don't want to react to whatever is happening.
How do you think, my friend Hedy?
Can you?
Yeah, hey, Oscar. I was just underlining that indeed being knowing and knowing already that you are not fully self-confident, but the first step is to be aware of it and watch yourself. And as is underlined then by Michael, is that it's already a vulnerability to show that you are not fully self-confident to do. Thank you. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
All right. So is everyone okay if we close the meetup? It's 7 minutes after 6 o'clock. So yeah, I can see Christoph is fine with that. So I can see other hands too. All right. So thank you, Karen,